Hey everyone, this is a review by Paul Hampton of Ian Birchall's book, Tony Cliff, a Marxist for His Time, published in 2011. Tony Cliff, quote, Si monumentum requiris circumspice. Si monumento requiris circumspice means, if you seek his memorial, look around you. It's from the plaque on the grave of Christopher Wren, architect in St. Paul's Cathedral. Ian Birchall was once derided for writing a loyalist history of the Socialist Workers Party, tragically entitled The Smallest Mass Party in the World. Birchall's new biography of the Socialist Workers Party's founder and inspirer, Tony Cliff, is equally farcical. Cliff was born Ygael Gluckstein. I don't know if I'm saying that name right. I know the last part I'm saying right, but Ygael Gluckstein is how I'm assuming you pronounce Tony Cliff's born name. Gluckstein grew up in the British Mandate of Palestine. After briefly flirting with Stalinism in 1933, Gluckstein became a left Zionist and then a Trotskyist. Gluckstein was imprisoned for anti-war activity in 1939-40. More information on that early part of his story would be interesting, but after Gluckstein moved to Britain in 1946 and became Tony Cliff, much of what he did was destructive of building a healthy revolutionary left. The standard, quote, Cliffite, end quote, line on Cliff is that he contributed three theories vital to rearming the left after 1945. State capitalism in the USSR, quote, permanent arms economy, and, quote, deflected permanent revolution, end quote. Instead of the celebrated Troika, Birchall attempts to elevate Cliff's importance in other areas. First, his writing on the Middle East. Second, his contributions on the class struggle in Britain. Third, and most importantly, his efforts to build the Socialist Workers Party. In fact, Cliff's, quote, lost, end quote, book on the Middle East, written in 1946, merely indicated his break from his relatively sane early writings as El Rock and his embrace of what would become left anti-Semitism on the question of Israel. Cliff came to oppose Jewish immigration into Palestine just as the extent of the Holocaust became clear. Cliff wrote off the Jewish working class as well as the possibility that Palestinian Arabs could win on their own. With no progressive force in the conflict, Cliff laid the basis for other substitutes, intellectually prefiguring the Socialist Workers' Party's flirtation with Hamas and other Islamists. Though Cliff would acknowledge in the early 1960s that, quote, what's done is done, the state of Israel existed and history could not be rolled back, end quote, Cliff drew no conclusions from this assessment and soon lurched into, quote, destroy Israel, end quote, mode. Israeli Jews were treated as an exception from every other nation. Cliff's mature legacy on the Middle East is thoroughly rotten. Cliff's writing on the British class struggle in the 1960s produced some snappy descriptions of, quote, do-it-yourself reformism, end quote. It was far harder to break militant workers from the grip of laborism, capital L laborism, the trade union bureaucracy, and Stalinism. In all this, Cliff lurched from an extreme voluntarism to the most arid pessimism, and by the end of the In all this, Cliff lurched from an extreme voluntarism to the most arid pessimism by the end of the 1970s. While trade union militancy did abate from the late 1970s, it was still vibrant, uneven, and capable of victories. The worst element of Cliff's, quote, downturn, end quote, perspective was not the attempt to assess the strength of working class forces. although even in that Cliff was prematurely defeatist. Rather, it was the political conclusions, principally that revolutionaries should walk away from trade union structures and from efforts to build an unofficial rank-and-file organization that could fight back. The nadir of this period in the Socialist Workers' Party's history came during the miners' strike. It virtually wrote off the struggle from the beginning and denounced those who backed the miners' support groups as, quote, left-wing Oxfam, end quote. It offered no strategy beyond more picketing. Persisting with pessimism, the Socialist Workers' Party initially denounced the poll tax non-payment campaign that emerged in 1988 to 89, then chased after militant in the wake of their growth. The ultimate measure of Cliff's legacy is the organization he spent 50 years building. The Socialist Workers' Party. A fair chunk of the biography consists of vignettes of various people who met Cliff and remained transfixed. Many are still nominally members of the, quote, party, end quote. For those like Ian Birchall, who have endured every twist and turn, none of it accounted for, the review of Cliff's life begs the question, what's left? Politics is not in command in the Socialist Workers' Party. What's left is whatever the current Central Committee says it is. There is no coherent and consistent politics behind it. Cliff's legacy is that the organization comes above the politics and before the ideological front of the class struggle. Cliff's version of, quote, Leninism, end quote, downgraded the need to work out a clear, consistent Marxist view of the world and instead substituted machine politics, where, quote, tactics contradict principles, end quote, where anything, any twist, turn, zigzag, is acceptable if it appears to build the Socialist Workers' Party. Hence the Socialist Workers' Party model, Thiele's, quote, Leninism, end quote, little internal democracy, no sharp ideological demarcation, little fight for clarity, no political accounting with earlier and other politics. Hence Cliff's decisive 1971 shift on the European community, to oppose the European community, to avoid isolation from the nationalist left. Hence the Socialist Workers' Party's promotion of anti-fascist, quote, festivals, end quote, over the active anti-fascist defense of black and Asian communities. Hence Cliff could characterize the Muslim Brotherhood as clerical fascists, and the Socialist Workers' Party could form alliances with them. The Socialist Workers' Party's rationalizations, most of them worked out when Cliff was in charge, were not justifiable changes because reality had changed. They were maneuvers in hope of building the Socialist Workers' Party, irrespective of what was being built. The Socialist Workers' Party is a machine for mangling militants. The Socialist Workers' Party despoils the British left. The Socialist Workers' Party ruins promising initiatives. The Socialist Workers' Party offers no concrete strategies and struggles, and the Socialist Workers' Party instead substitutes stripped-down banality in place of socialist answers. Cliff built the Socialist Workers' Party into the locust of the left the Socialist Workers' Party is today. Cliff had an almost Maoist way with catchphrases. Cliff often said that post-Trotskyism was like trying to find your way around the Paris metro with a map of the London Tube. But Cliff's, quote, Marxism, end quote, burned the map and instead navigated using his own astrology. New section. The Three Great Theories? Question mark. The Cliffite mythology held that Cliff explained the expansion of Stalinism with his theory of state capitalism, explained the revival of capitalism from his permanent arms economy theory, and understood third world developments with his theory of, quote, deflected permanent revolution, end quote. The Alliance for Workers' Liberty has long argued that this Cliff fable does not withstand scrutiny. Remarkably, Ian Birchall concedes these weaknesses. The theory of, quote, deflected permanent revolution, end quote, amounted to one scrappy, obscure article. The theory of, quote, deflected permanent revolution, end quote, treated, quote, the revolution, end quote, in the Third World as a semi-automatic process, much like other, quote, orthodox, end quote, post-Trotsky Trotskyists did, allowing middle-class intellectuals and other strata to substitute for working-class leadership, with only a disagreement about the outcome, almost inevitably a form of state capitalism. Nowhere did Cliff anticipate the rise of industrial working classes and labor movements in places such as Iraq, Indonesia, South Korea, Brazil, and South Africa, which could lead the fight for democracy and potentially for socialism. Birchall concedes that Cliff borrowed the permanent arms economy without attribution from Shachtman's tendency. Birchall acknowledges that the idea of arms production propping up capitalism was commonplace, and it explained neither the long boom nor the slump that followed after 1973. What really defined Cliff's group in the CND period, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament period, early and mid-60s, when it talked most about the permanent arms economy, was its belief in the stability of capitalism. Despite Chris Harman's efforts to breathe life into the permanent arms economy corpse, the Socialist Workers Party have largely discarded it. As for Cliff's, quote, state capitalism, end quote, Cliff's 1948 analysis treats Russia as one big factory, but, quote, capital, end quote, which doesn't compete with other capitals is not capital in the Marxist sense. Cliff thought he could neutralize the objection by postulating international use value competition in the form of armaments. This was certainly an innovation, but not one consistent with Marxist political economy, where capitals compete for a share of the surplus value pumped out of waged workers. Originally, Cliff admitted that Soviet labor power was not a commodity. His, quote, theory, end quote, was actually a description of a bureaucratic collectivist state with, quote, state capitalism, end quote, an arbitrary label. The downfall of the USSR showed the paucity of Cliff's assessment. Cliff had defined state capitalism as a higher stage of development than Western capitalism. In 1948, Cliff had referred to the USSR as the, quote, extreme theoretical limit which capitalism can reach, end quote, and a transition stage to socialism. However, when the Soviet Union reached its structural impasse, Cliff supporters simply floundered. As late as 1987, the Socialist Workers Party Russia, quote, expert, end quote, Mike Haynes, criticized those who believed that the crisis of Soviet society was terminal. Harman argued in 1990 that after rapid industrialization from the 1930s to the 1960s, walled off from the world market, the USSR had suffered a, quote, normal accumulation crisis, end quote, which forced the bureaucracy, quote, to try to change its ways, end quote. It is possible to define Russia as, quote, state capitalist, end quote, in Cliff's sense only by reasoning with dubious analogies. 1. In capitalism of type X, Y occurred. Y occurred in the Soviet Union. Therefore, the Soviet Union is capitalist. Cliff's, quote, theory, end quote, of state capitalism never succeeded in being both Marxist and consistent with the facts. The end.